They are walking. 7 men, maybe 6, the numbers change depending on who's telling the story, stumbling through snow that reaches their thighs. Behind them, Siberia, a Soviet Gulag. Barbed wire and guard towers and a life sentence for crimes they may or may not have committed. Ahead of them, everything else. 4,000 miles of wilderness, mountains, deserts, no map, no supplies, no realistic chance of survival. They have escaped, but escape is just the beginning. Now they have to walk across an entire continent. Through Siberian forests where temperatures drop to -40, through the Gobi Desert where there is no water for days, through the Himalayas where the air becomes so thin that every step feels like drowning. Some of them will die along the way. The ones who survive will arrive in British India months later, walking skeletons, barely human. They will tell a story so extraordinary that it will become a best-selling book, translated into dozens of languages, adapted into a Hollywood film. The story of the greatest escape of the 20th century. There's just one problem. It probably never happened. This is Lines Across Asia, Episode 4, and this time we're crossing a different kind of line, the line between truth and myth, between what we want to believe and what actually occurred. This is the story of the Long Walk, and the story about the story. His name was Sławomir Rawicz, Polish, born 1915, a cavalry officer when Germany and the Soviet Union carved up Poland in 1939. According to his account, published in 1956 as a book called The Long Walk, he was captured by Soviet forces, interrogated, tortured, and sentenced to 25 years hard labor in a gulag in Siberia. The year was 1940. He was 25 years old. Now, gulags were real. Brutally, horrifically real. The Soviet labor camp system imprisoned millions, political prisoners, intellectuals, soldiers, anyone deemed an enemy of the state. Conditions were designed to break you. Starvation rations, forced labor in sub-zero temperatures, beatings, disease. The average life expectancy in a Siberian gulag was measured in months, not years. So when Rawicz claimed that in 1941 he and 6 other prisoners escaped from a camp near Yakutsk, one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth, it was plausible. Desperate men attempt desperate things. According to his story, the escape was enabled by an unlikely ally, the wife of a Soviet commandant who took pity on them. She provided tools, supplies, information about guard rotations. On a freezing night in April 1941, they simply walked out, past the wire, past the guards, into the endless Siberian forest, and then they started walking south. The group, as Rawicz described it, himself, the Polish officer Mr. Smith, an American engineer, the book never explains what an American was doing in a Soviet gulag, a Yugoslav, several Polish prisoners, a teenage girl named Kristina who joined them along the way, fleeing Soviet oppression. Their plan was simple and insane. Walk to India, through Siberia, through Mongolia, through the Gobi Desert, through Tibet, through the Himalayas, 4,000 miles, on foot. If you're already thinking, that sounds impossible, you're not alone. But let me tell you the story first, the full story, as Rawicz told it, because even if it's not true, and we'll get to that, it's one of the most extraordinary survival narratives ever put to paper. Inside the gulag, escape was a fantasy that kept you alive. Everyone talked about it, in whispers, in the few moments when guards weren't listening. But talking and doing are different things. The camp near Yakutsk, Camp 303, if Ravich's account is accurate, was designed to make escape suicidal. Barbed wire, watchtowers with searchlights, armed guards with orders to shoot on sight, and beyond the wire, the Siberian wilderness, thousands of miles of forest and tundra in every direction, no roads, no villages, no help. In winter, temperatures dropped to -50 Celsius. Your spit would freeze before it hit the ground. In summer, the mosquitoes came in clouds so thick they could suffocate you. Most prisoners who tried to escape died within days. Hypothermia, starvation, or a bullet in the back. But Rawicz claimed he started planning anyway. He observed the guard rotations, memorized the patrol patterns, noted which guards were lazy, which were alert. He befriended other prisoners who had skills, a man who knew how to navigate by stars, another who understood wilderness survival, a Yugoslav who had experience in mountains. They didn't talk openly, too dangerous. A single informant could end everything. Instead, they communicated through glances, through coded conversations during forced labor, through the silent language of desperation. And then, according to Rawicz, came the miracle, the commandant's wife. Her name is never given in the book. She remains anonymous, a figure of improbable compassion in a system designed to crush it. Rawicz claimed she approached him during a work detail, spoke to him in broken Polish, said she couldn't bear what was being done to these men. Over weeks, she allegedly provided them with intelligence, which guards could be bribed, which nights the patrols would be thinner, where tools were kept, an axe, wire cutters, a knife. And finally, one night in April 1941, she supposedly gave them the signal. Tonight. Now, this is the part that makes historians skeptical. A Soviet commandant's wife helping prisoners escape, risking her own life, her husband's position, everything. It's the kind of detail that feels invented, too convenient, too much like a plot device. But let's stay with Rawicz's version, because whether it's true or not, this is how he told it. April 1941. The temperature is just above freezing, warm by Siberian standards, which means the snow is slushy, harder to track footprints in. 7 men, Rawicz, Mr. Smith the American, the Yugoslav, several Poles, gather in the barracks after lights out. No one speaks. They've hidden small bundles, dried bread stolen from rations over weeks, cloth for wrapping feet, a knife, an axe. Not enough. Nowhere near enough. But enough to try. At midnight, they move. According to Rawicz, the wire cutters work. Barely. The fence is old, maintained poorly in this remote outpost. They slip through one at a time. Every sound seems impossibly loud. Every footstep, every breath. In the watchtower, a guard shifts. A searchlight sweeps across the compound. They freeze. The light passes. They move again. And then they're outside the wire, in the forest, free. Except they're not free at all. They're in the middle of Siberia, hundreds of miles from anything, with Soviet patrols hunting anyone who runs. Now the real escape begins. They run at first. Panic and adrenaline override exhaustion. They run until their lungs burn, until they can't take another step. Then they walk. South. Always south. Using the stars, the North Star behind them, Orion's belt as a guide. They don't know exactly where they're going, just away. The first days are the worst. They expect to hear dogs, gunshots, shouts in Russian ordering them to stop. Every sound makes them freeze. A branch snapping. Is it an animal or a patrol? Voices in the distance. Villagers or soldiers? They sleep in shifts. 2 awake, 5 sleeping. Always ready to run. They eat pine needles, tree bark, anything to quiet the gnawing hunger. And they keep moving. According to Rawicz, they walked for 3 weeks before they felt safe enough to move during daylight. 3 weeks of hiding, of terror, of waiting for capture. Think about that. 21 days where every moment could be your last free moment. Where recapture means torture, execution, or something worse. Being sent to an even more brutal camp as an example to others. Here's what people don't realize about escaping a Soviet Gulag. The hard part isn't getting out of the camp. The hard part is getting out of the Soviet Union. Because the USSR in 1941 was the largest country on Earth. 11 time zones, a sixth of the world's land surface. You could walk for months and still be in Soviet territory. Still hunted. still illegal, still one checkpoint away from recapture. Ravich's group had to cross thousands of miles of Siberia before they even reached a border. They avoided roads, avoided villages, avoided anything that might have people who could report them. They walked through forests so dense the sun barely penetrated. They crossed frozen rivers, terrified the ice would crack. They skirted around towns by miles, seeing the lights in the distance and aching for warmth, for food, for human contact, but knowing they couldn't risk it. Sometimes they had to hide for days. Once, according to the book, a Soviet patrol passed within 20 meters of where they lay hidden in dense undergrowth. They didn't breathe, didn't move. Insects crawled over their faces, and they couldn't brush them away. If one of them had coughed, if someone had shifted position and snapped a twig, over. But the patrol passed, and they waited another hour before moving, just to be sure. This is when Kristina joined them. The teenage girl fleeing the Soviet system, maybe from a collective farm, maybe from her own imprisonment. Rawicz is vague on the details. She spotted them in the forest and, instead of running or screaming, she asked to come with them. The men debated. A girl would slow them down, would need protection, would be a liability. But she wouldn't leave, and turning her in was unthinkable. So she walked with them, and Rawicz wrote later that she became their conscience, the reason to keep going when they wanted to quit, because if they gave up, she would die too. They walked for 4 months through Soviet territory, 4 months of hiding, of fear, of checking every horizon for the dust of vehicles, every sound for the bark of tracking dogs. The psychological toll was worse than the physical suffering, because you can endure hunger, you can endure cold, but the constant terror, the knowledge that you are hunted, that you are prey, that breaks people. Many nights, Rawicz wrote, one of them would say, "Let's just stop, turn ourselves in, at least we tried." But they never did, because they'd come too far to go back. And then, one morning in late summer 1941, the forest began to thin. The trees became sparse, then scattered, then gone. Ahead of them, grassland, steppe, rolling hills that stretched to the horizon. They had reached the edge of Siberia. Somewhere ahead, maybe kilometers, maybe dozens of kilometers, lay the border with Mongolia. No fence, no signs, just an invisible line on a map where Soviet territory ended and Mongolian territory began. But crossing that line meant everything, because Mongolia, though nominally independent, was under Soviet influence. There would still be danger, still patrols, but it wasn't the USSR. It wasn't home territory for the Gulag system. It was the first step toward truly being free. They walked faster now, urgency overriding exhaustion. According to Rawicz, they crossed the border at night without knowing exactly when it happened. No marker, no fence, no guard post, just step on one side and step on the other. But they could feel it, a psychological shift. For the first time in months, they weren't looking over their shoulders quite so obsessively. Mongolia brought new challenges. The landscape was more open, harder to hide. Water was scarce. Villages were far apart. But the fear changed quality. Instead of being hunted criminals, they were now illegal travelers. Still at risk, but less likely to be shot on sight. They could, occasionally, carefully, approach a remote herdsman and beg for food. Most times they were turned away. Mongolians had their own hardships, their own fears of authority. But once or twice, someone took pity, gave them dried meat, fermented mare's milk, directions, small kindnesses that felt like miracles. And they kept walking south, through the Mongolian steppe, toward the next impossible crossing, the Gobi Desert. If the Siberian forest tried to freeze them to death, the Gobi Desert tried to bake them alive. The landscape changed from grass to scrub to nothing. just sand and rock and heat that radiated up from the ground in waves. Temperatures soared past 40 degrees Celsius, over 100 Fahrenheit. At night, it dropped below freezing. Your body couldn't regulate, couldn't adapt. You were either cooking or shivering, never comfortable, never at rest. Water became the only thing that mattered. Not food, not shelter, not rest. Water. They walked at night to avoid the worst heat. Slept, if you could call it sleep, during the day in whatever shade they could find. A rock outcropping, a dried riverbed. They dug beneath dry riverbeds searching for moisture. Sometimes they found damp sand they could squeeze into their mouths. Sometimes they found nothing. They rationed the little they had with an almost religious discipline. Each person got the same amount. No exceptions, no arguments. Because the moment you broke that rule, the moment survival became individual instead of collective, everyone died. And here, in the Gobi, Kristina died. Rawicz doesn't give many details. Maybe he couldn't bear to. He writes that one morning she simply didn't wake up. Not dramatically, not crying out in pain. She just lay down one night and didn't get up. Dehydration, exhaustion, the accumulation of months of deprivation finally overwhelming her young body. The men buried her in the sand. They had no tools, they used their hands. They said no prayers, none of them knew what to say. And then they kept walking, because stopping meant joining her. By the time they reached the edge of Tibet, only 4 remained. The American, Mr. Smith, had died in the desert. One of the Poles had simply walked off one night and never returned. Madness or despair, they never knew. 4 men who had lost half their body weight, whose skin was burned leather, whose feet were masses of scar tissue that no longer felt pain because the nerves were destroyed. And ahead, the Himalayas, mountains that soared over 18,000 feet, where the air has so little oxygen you can barely think, where a single misstep means falling thousands of feet. Rawicz claimed they saw yeti in those mountains, 2 creatures, tall and covered in reddish fur, watching them from a distance. Whether that was real or hallucination from altitude and starvation, who can say? They kept climbing. And finally, after nearly a year of walking, they stumbled into a British patrol in northern India. 4 skeletal men, barely able to speak, telling a story so wild that the British officers thought they were spies or insane. But they weren't. If the story is true, if any of this happened, they were survivors. That's the story as Sławomir Rawicz told it. That's the story that became The Long Walk. That's the story millions of people read and believed. And now I need to tell you why it probably isn't true. If the Siberian forest tried to freeze them to death, the Gobi tried to bake them. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water became the only thing that mattered. They walked at night to avoid the worst heat. They dug for moisture beneath dry riverbeds. They rationed the little they found with an almost religious discipline. And here, in the Gobi, Kristina died. Rawicz describes finding her one morning, simply lying down as if asleep. Dehydration, exhaustion, the accumulation of months of deprivation. They buried her in the sand and kept walking, because stopping meant dying. By the time they reached the edge of Tibet, only 4 of them remained. 4 men who had lost half their body weight, whose skin was burned and cracked, whose feet were masses of scar tissue. And ahead of them, the Himalayas. They climbed, through passes over 18,000 feet high, where the air has so little oxygen you can barely think, through snow and ice, through terrain where a single misstep means falling thousands of feet. Rawicz claimed they saw something impossible in those mountains. 2 creatures, tall, over 7 feet, covered in reddish-brown fur, walking upright like humans but clearly not human. Yeti. They watched from a distance, too exhausted to be afraid, too rational to believe what they were seeing. Then they kept walking. And finally, after a year of walking, after crossing an entire continent, they stumbled into a British checkpoint in northern India. 4 skeletal men, speaking broken English, telling a story so wild that the British officers initially thought they were insane or German spies. But they weren't. They were survivors. That's the story Sławomir Rawicz told. That's the story that became The Long Walk. That's the story that millions of people read and believed. And now I need to tell you why it probably isn't true. For decades, The Long Walk was accepted as fact, a miraculous survival story, a testament to human endurance. But some details never quite added up. The mysterious American, Mr. Smith, who appears in the Gulag with no explanation. The commandant's wife who helps them escape, a convenient plot device. The yeti sighting, which even supporters of the book found hard to swallow. And the biggest problem, no corroborating evidence, no documentation of the escape, no records from the British checkpoint in India, no testimony from other survivors, just Rawicz's word. In the 1990s and early 2000s, researchers started digging deeper. BBC investigative journalists tracked down Soviet archives that had been sealed during the Cold War. They found Sławomir Rawicz's prisoner file, and it told a different story. According to Soviet records, Rawicz was indeed arrested in 1939. He was indeed sentenced to hard labour. He was sent to a gulag. But in 1942, he was released as part of an amnesty for Polish prisoners after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. He joined the Polish army in exile and made his way to India through official channels, by train, by ship, through Allied military routes. No escape, no epic walk, no 4,000 miles on foot. When confronted with this evidence in 2006, Rawicz, who was still alive at 91, didn't admit the story was false, but he didn't confirm it either. He said his memory was unreliable, that he'd been through trauma, that the details might be confused. He died later that year, leaving the question unresolved. So what actually happened? One theory, Rawicz heard stories from other prisoners, stories of real escape attempts, real deaths in the taiga and deserts. He stitched these fragments together, added his own experiences of suffering in the Gulag, and created a composite narrative. Another theory, he fabricated the entire journey but based it on real geographical knowledge, which is why the route is technically possible even if he never walked it. A third theory, more generous, he genuinely believed his own story. Trauma, PTSD, decades of retelling. Memory is unreliable, especially when mixed with survival and suffering. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. Someone tried to prove it was possible. Someone actually attempted to follow Rawicz's route, to see if a human being could survive that journey. His name is Sylvain Tesson, French, born 1972, a traveller, writer and adventurer obsessed with extreme journeys and the idea of testing human limits. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Tesson read The Long Walk, and unlike most readers who just enjoyed it as a story, Tesson thought, can it be done? So he decided to find out. Tesson didn't follow Rawicz's exact route. The geopolitical landscape had changed, borders shifted, permissions difficult. But he attempted a similar trajectory, from Siberia toward the south, through some of the harshest terrain on Earth, mostly on foot. He documented the experience in his own writing, bringing modern equipment but trying to understand what such a journey would actually require. And what did Tesson discover? That it's technically possible, but just barely. That the distances Rawicz claimed to cover in certain timeframes are at the absolute edge of human capability. That surviving the Gobi without supplies would require almost supernatural luck. That crossing the Himalayas without mountaineering equipment would be suicidal. Tesson concluded something nuanced. Could someone walk from Siberia to India? Yes. Could they do it in the way and time frame Rawicz described? Extremely unlikely. Could they do it without any of the escapees dying until deep into the journey? Almost impossible. But Tesson also discovered something else, that the landscape itself, the brutal, magnificent, indifferent landscape, doesn't care about your story. The tiger doesn't care if you're escaping or exploring. The desert doesn't care if you're running from tyranny or seeking adventure. The mountains don't distinguish between truth and fiction. They just exist, and you either survive them or you don't. Tesson's journey added another layer to the legend. It didn't prove Rawicz right, but it didn't prove him completely wrong either. It proved that the journey exists in a strange space between possible and impossible, between truth and myth. So here's the question that matters. If the story probably isn't true, if the evidence suggests Rawicz never made that journey, why does it still resonate? Why do millions of people want to believe it? Because we need stories of impossible survival, especially stories that emerge from the darkest moments of history. The 20th century gave us industrialized horror, the Holocaust, the Gulags, wars that killed tens of millions. In the face of that darkness, we desperately need stories of people who refused to break, who walked 4,000 miles rather than accept their sentence, who chose freedom over safety, who survived. The long walk offers something psychologically powerful. The idea that the human spirit cannot be completely crushed. That even in the worst system humanity has ever created, a system designed to erase individuals, to turn people into numbers, to work them to death, someone escaped. Someone walked to freedom. Someone won. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people in gulags didn't escape. Most people died. The survival rate was horrific. The suffering was unimaginable. And there's a danger in mythologizing one miraculous story while forgetting the millions who had no miracle. There's a term in narrative psychology, survival bias. We remember the extraordinary story, the one person who walked 4,000 miles, and we forget the thousands who tried to escape and died in the forest. We tell the uplifting tale and ignore the statistical reality of oppression. This doesn't mean we shouldn't tell survival stories, but it means we have to be honest about what they are. Exceptions, not rules. Inspiration, yes, but not representative of what most people experienced. And maybe, the fact that the long walk might not be literally true doesn't actually matter. Maybe it's true in a different way. True as a representation of the desire for freedom. True as an articulation of what people in gulags dreamed about, even if they couldn't achieve it. True as myth, even if not as history. Let me tell you about another book, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Presented as a non-fiction novel, a true crime story reported like journalism but written like literature. Except research later revealed that Capote fabricated conversations, invented details, shaped the truth to create a better story. Does that make it fiction, or a different kind of truth? Or consider Into the Wild, John Krakauer's account of Christopher McCandless. Based on real events, but filtered through Krakauer's interpretation, his own experiences, his narrative choices. The truth of what happened to McCandless is inseparable from how Krakauer chose to tell it. Here's what I'm getting at. All stories, even true stories, are constructed. Memory is unreliable. Trauma distorts. Time erodes. Storytellers shape. The question isn't just, did this happen exactly as described? The question is, what kind of truth is this story trying to tell? Sławomir Rawicz's The Long Walk might not be factually accurate. The escape might not have happened. The route might be embellished. The Yeti sighting was probably hallucination or invention. But the suffering of Gulag prisoners? Absolutely true. The human desire for freedom? Absolutely true. The lengths people will go to survive? Absolutely true. The story captures something real, even if the specific journey didn't happen. And maybe that's why it endures, because it's not really about whether one man walked 4,000 miles. It's about what we do when we're trapped, when the system says, you will die here, when hope is irrational, when survival means attempting the impossible. Do we accept it, or do we walk? Sylvain Tesson didn't go into the wilderness to prove Rawicz was a liar. He went because the story haunted him, because he needed to understand what that kind of journey would do to a person. Not just physically. Anyone can research hypothermia and dehydration, but psychologically. What happens to your mind when you walk for months with no destination guaranteed, when every day is the same brutal question, keep walking or lie down and die? Tesson wrote about the strange psychological states extreme journeys produce, the way time distorts, days blur together, the way your sense of self begins to dissolve. You're not a person anymore, you're a body that walks. The way meaning collapses into the immediate, water, shelter, the next step. He wrote about moments of transcendence, sunrises over empty steppes, the silence of the Gobi, the strange peace that comes from surrendering to the journey. And he wrote about the terror, the nights when you're sure you won't survive, the moments when your body simply refuses to continue, the edge between living and giving up. And here's what Tesson understood that many critics of Rawicz miss. It doesn't matter if the specific details are accurate. The emotional truth, the psychological reality of that kind of journey, is real. Whether Rawicz walked it or imagined it, he understood what it would feel like. The exhaustion, the desperation, the small victories, the losses. That knowledge comes from somewhere. Maybe from the Gulag itself. Maybe from other prisoners' stories. Maybe from his own survival, however it actually happened. Tesson didn't prove the long walk was true, but he proved it was possible. And possibility is its own kind of truth. Every episode of this podcast has been about crossing lines. Ella Maillard crossed continents in a time when women weren't supposed to. Alexandra David Neal crossed into forbidden Lhasa, disguised as someone she wasn't. Puyi crossed from emperor to citizen, from power to anonymity. And now, the long walk. What line does this story cross? It crosses the line between history and legend, between documentation and imagination, between what happened and what we need to believe happened. And maybe that's the most important crossing of all, because the stories that endure, the myths that last, aren't always the most accurate. They're the ones that capture something true about being human. The Odyssey probably didn't happen. Gilgamesh definitely didn't. The specifics of the Exodus are historically disputed. But these stories endure because they contain truths that facts alone can't convey. The struggle against impossible odds, the journey toward home or freedom or meaning, the refusal to accept fate. The long walk might belong in that category. Not history exactly, but not fiction either. Something in between. A story that's true in the way myths are true.